"No man will ever want you," her father said, and then he spat into the dust like the words had left a bad taste behind. Ruth Calloway didn't flinch. She had learned, over 22 years under that roof, that flinching only fed him. She stood in the doorway of the barn with a scar running pale and jagged from her left ear to her jaw, a mark left by a spooked horse when she was 12, and she watched her father mount his gelding without looking back at her. "Fine supper waiting on you when you get home," she said. It wasn't kindness. It was habit, the way a beaten dog still wags its tail. He rode off toward town without answering. Dust rose behind his horse and hung gold in the late afternoon light, and Ruth stood there a long moment, feeling the emptiness of the yard settle into her chest the way it always did. A house too big for the silence in it. A father who filled every room with disappointment and left every field to weeds. She had not always believed him. There had been a time, years back, when she still thought some drover or shopkeeper's son might look past the scar and see her. See the woman who could break a horse in an afternoon, who could red the sky for a storm 2 days out, who kept her mother's Bible on the shelf though the pages were falling loose. But 3 seasons of dances where the men's eyes slid off her like rain off tin. 3 seasons of her father's voice at her back reminding her what she was worth, had worn the belief down to nothing. She had made her peace with the nothing, or told herself she had. The stranger came at dusk. She heard him before she saw him. The slow clop of a tired horse, the creak of saddle leather, a low cough that spoke of dust in the throat and miles behind him. She had the shotgun off the wall and cracked open before she reached the porch rail, because a woman alone learned that much, at least. He sat his horse at the edge of the yard, not coming closer, hat brim low enough to shadow his eyes. A rangy man, maybe 35, with a jaw set hard against something. Pain, she'd guess, from the way he held his left arm close to his ribs. "Ma'am," he said, "didn't mean to come up on you at this hour. My horse threw a shoe 2 miles back and I've been walking him since. Saw your lamp. There's no man here to vouch for you," Ruth said, which was truer than she liked. "You'll state your business from there. Name's Tom Hallett. I bought the old weather spread, west side of the creek. 3 days ago." He shifted, and she saw him hiss through his teeth at the movement. "Got thrown from a Mustang I was fool enough to think I could gentle. Crack something in my side, I expect. I'm not looking for trouble, ma'am. Just a place to rest the horse and maybe buy some water, if you'll allow it." She should have sent him on. Should have told him the Hendricks place was another 4 miles and they kept a barn open for travelers. That was what her father would have told her to do. Turn away every stranger, trust no one, because trust was for people who could afford to lose. But there was something in the way he sat that horse. Upright despite the pain, proud despite the dust, the way a man sits when he has nothing left to prove and has stopped trying, that made her lower the shotgun an inch. "Barn's around back," she said. "There's a pump by the trough. I'll bring out some liniment for that side, if you'll let me look at it. That's kindness I didn't ask for. I didn't offer it for you to ask." She turned toward the house, then stopped, some old caution rising in her. "My father's not home. Won't be, till late. You understand what I'm telling you?" Something crossed his face. Not the leer she half expected, not the calculation of a man weighing opportunity. Something closer to respect. "I understand you're telling me you've got a shotgun and you know how to use it, and that you're trusting me anyway. I won't make you regret it." He said it plain, the way a man states a fact about the weather, and something in her chest, some old, calloused, disbelieving thing, turned over like soil breaking for the first time in years. She did not know, as she walked back to fetch the liniment and a clean rag, that her father was at that very hour in the saloon in town, telling anyone who'd listen that his daughter was a burden he intended to be rid of by spring. Sold off in marriage to Walton Price, a hog farmer twice her age with mean little eyes and a reputation for breaking things that couldn't fight back. She did not know that Tom Hallett's cracked rib was the least of the wounds he carried, or that the Mustang he'd been fool enough to gentle was not the reason he'd left Missouri 3 months before. She only knew that when she came back out onto the porch, the stranger had taken his hat off, and in the low gold light his eyes were the kind that looked at a person and saw them. She worked the liniment into the bruised muscle along his ribs with hands that had set broken fence posts and stitched torn saddle leather. Hands used to work rather than tenderness, and if he noticed the roughness of her touch he said nothing of it. You didn't have to do this, he said again, quieter this time. I know how to set a rib wrong and make a man worse than he started, she said. Figured I'd do it right or not at all. He laughed. A short, surprised sound, like it had come loose from somewhere he'd locked it away. That how you do most things. That's how I do all things. She tied off the wrap and stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron. You'll want to keep off that side a week minimum. No lifting. Man can't run a spread without lifting. Man can't run a spread with a rib through his lung either. She said it flat, but there was something almost like a smile pulling at the corner of her mouth, the first in longer than she could remember. He stayed the night in the barn, against her better judgment and her father's certain fury if he knew. She brought him supper, cornbread and beans, nothing fancy, and sat on an overturned crate while he ate, telling herself she only meant to make sure he didn't take sick in the night. That was the lie she told herself. The truth was quieter and stranger. She did not want to go back into that empty house yet. You've got a place of your own, he said, between bites. Why do you stay here? The question landed harder than he could have known. She looked at her hands. My mother's buried on this land. And a woman without a husband doesn't have many places to go that aren't worse than this one. Your father the one who did that. He nodded, not unkindly, toward the scar on her jaw. Horse did that. My father just makes sure I remember it. She hadn't meant to say that much. She stood, brushing off her skirt. You should sleep. I'll bring coffee at first light, and then you'll be moving on. Ruth. It was the first time he'd used her name, and she didn't remember telling it to him. She must have, somewhere in the hour's talk, without noticing the giving of it. For what it's worth. Whatever he told you about what you're worth, what a man would want. He's wrong. I've known plenty of men. Most of them couldn't set a rib to save their own hide, let alone somebody else's. She didn't answer. She walked back to the house with her arms crossed against the night chill, and did not let herself cry until the door was shut behind her. Her father came home near midnight, loud with whiskey and worse temper. She heard him from her room, the crash of a chair knocked aside, the mutter of Walton Price's name, the word arrangement used the way a man uses it when he's already spent money he doesn't have. She lay rigid in the dark and understood, with the particular clarity that comes at that hour, that her father meant to sell her the way he'd sell a horse he no longer wanted to feed. Quickly, before anyone looked too closely at the goods. By morning, Tom Hallett's horse was shod. She'd sent the boy from the Hendricks place to fetch old Ezra the blacksmith at first light, paid for it herself out of the tin she kept hidden beneath a floorboard, egg money she'd been saving toward nothing in particular. Tom found her at the pump, and the look on his face when he understood what she'd done. Quiet, searching, like he was recalculating something about the whole of her. Stayed with her longer than she wanted to admit. I can't take charity, he said. It isn't charity. It's payment. You looked at that rib bandage like it was worth something to you. Consider us square. She handed him the reins. Where will you go from here? Home. Such as it is. He hesitated, hat in hand, and there was a whole conversation happening in the space where he wasn't saying something. Ruth, if a man were to come calling, proper-like, hat in hand, asking your father for permission the old-fashioned way, would that be a fool's errand? Her heart did something complicated and painful in her chest, some rusted mechanism trying to turn after years of disuse. My father would laugh in your face and then sell me to Walton Price out of spite, just to prove the point that no one wants me except for money. Then I won't ask him. Tom's jaw set, and for the first time she saw the man beneath the pain and the dust. Steady, deliberate, not a man given to rash promises, which made the next words carry more weight than they should have from a stranger of one night. I'll ask you instead, would it be a fool's errand? Down the road, unseen by either of them, a rider was already approaching. Her father, sober now and mean with the clarity of a hangover, and beside him on a mule, small-eyed and smiling in a way that made her skin crawl, rode Walton Price. Ruth! Her father's voice cracked across the yard like a whip before she'd even registered the sound of hooves. Get in the house. She turned, and her stomach dropped at the sight of Walton Price sitting his mule with the satisfied slouch of a man who believed the matter already settled. A man looking over property he considered already bought. Pa, I know what this is. Her father swung down off his horse, and the whiskey sourness of him carried across the yard even from 10 feet off. His eyes found Tom, found the horse newly shod, found the liniment-stained rag still tucked in Ruth's apron pocket, and something ugly moved across his face. "You let a drifter sleep in my barn while I was gone?" He was hurt. I gave him a place to rest, nothing more. Nothing more. Her father's laugh had no humor in it. "That's not what it looks like from where I'm standing, girl." Tom stepped forward, slow and deliberate, positioning himself half a pace in front of Ruth without seeming to think about it. The kind of instinct that couldn't be faked. "Sir, my name is Tom Hallett. I bought the Weathers place west of the creek. Your daughter showed a stranger Christian kindness when he was in pain. Nothing happened here that you need to draw a conclusion about. I didn't ask your name." Her father's hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip, not drawing, just resting there. A threat dressed as a habit. "And I didn't ask your opinion of my daughter's virtue. She's spoken for. Mr. Price here has an arrangement with me, and it doesn't concern a saddle tramp with a busted rib and no land worth mentioning." Walton Price finally spoke, and his voice was soft in a way that made the hair rise on Ruth's arms. "No need for hard feelings, Calloway. Girl's got spirit. I don't mind spirit. Breaks in easier than you'd think. Once the ring's on her finger." His small eyes traveled over her the way a man looks at livestock, and Ruth felt something in her that had been quiet for years. Some old ember of fury she'd let her father smother, catch and flare. "I am not a horse to be broken, Mr. Price," she said, and her voice did not shake. "And I am not my father's to arrange." "You're under my roof," her father snapped. "Everything under my roof is mine to arrange, including you, and you'll remember that or you'll find yourself a roof of your own. Which, I promise you, girl, no man is fool enough to offer." "I'm offering," Tom said. The yard went silent except for the wind moving through the dry grass and a horse stamping somewhere behind the barn. Ruth's father turned slowly, and something calculating replaced the anger in his face. The look of a man reassessing the value of merchandise he'd thought worthless. "You're offering," he repeated. "You've known her one night. I've known plenty of men my whole life who never once showed the kind of steadiness your daughter showed me in one evening. I don't need more time to know quality when I see it." Tom's voice was even, but Ruth could see the tension along his jaw, the careful way he kept his weight off his injured side, the readiness in his stance despite the pain. "I've got 80 acres, a cabin that needs a woman's hand but a good roof over it, and a herd I mean to build honest year on year. I'm not a rich man, but I'd never look at Ruth the way Mr. Price just did." Walton Price's mule shifted as the small man's face darkened. "Watch your tongue, Hallett. I'll watch it as close as you watch where your eyes land, Price." For a moment Ruth thought it would come to blood right there in the yard. Her father's hand still resting on his pistol, Price's face flushing red, Tom standing wounded but unmoving between her and both of them. Then her father did something that surprised her more than any threat could have. He laughed, short and ugly. "You want her, Hallett? Fine. But you'll pay for the privilege same as Price would've. $50, and she's yours free and clear, and I wash my hands of the whole business." Ruth felt something in her chest crack open, not at the price on her head, which she had long since stopped expecting to be worth anything at all, but at the casual cruelty of it, spoken in front of her as though she were a mule herself, not a woman with a beating heart standing 3 feet away. $50, Tom said slowly, "for a man's daughter. You'd sell her like livestock." "I'd sell her for less, to be shed of her mouth," her father said. "You want to marry the girl, that's your business. But you'll pay what Price would have paid, or you'll ride on and leave well enough alone." Ruth looked at Tom, saw him do the math behind his eyes, saw the flicker of calculation that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with a cracked rib, a half-built herd, and a bank account that likely didn't hold 50 spare dollars, and braced herself for the answer she was certain was coming. An apology, a retreat, the same slow fading away every other man had managed in her 22 years. "I don't have $50 on me," Tom said, "but I've got a herd worth 4 times that, and I'll bring you the deed to prove it if you'll give me till Sunday." Her father's eyes narrowed, weighing the offer the way he weighed every offer, for how much he could extract, never for what it cost anyone else. "Sunday then. Not a day past. And if you don't show, I'll have the arrangement with Price stand. Understood?" He mounted up without waiting for an answer, Walton Price trailing behind him wearing a look of thwarted appetite that made Ruth's skin crawl anew, and the two of them rode off toward town in a cloud of dust that seemed, to Ruth, to carry away some of the air she'd been able to breathe only moments before. Silence settled over the yard. Tom exhaled slowly, and only then did Ruth see how badly his hands were shaking. Not from fear of her father, she understood, but from the cost of standing steady through all of it with a cracked rib screaming beneath his shirt. "You should sit," she said, already moving to help him toward the porch step. "I should apologize," he said instead, lowering himself down with a grimace. That was no way for a woman to hear herself spoken of. "I'm sorry you had to stand there and listen to it. I've heard worse from him my whole life." She sat beside him, closer than propriety strictly allowed, though there was no one left in the yard to mind. "You don't have to do this, Tom. Whatever you said in there, you don't owe me a rescue. You met me yesterday. I know what I said, and I know how long I've known you." He turned to look at her, and there was none of the performance in his face now that there'd been in front of her father. Just plain, tired honesty. "My wife died 18 months ago, Ruth. Fever took her in 3 days, and I buried her outside Springfield and rode west because I couldn't stand to look at that house another season. I told myself I was done. Done wanting anything, done trusting anything wouldn't be taken from me the moment I let myself care about it." He reached into his coat and drew out a small object, worn smooth with handling. A carved wooden bird, rough but clearly made with care, one wing slightly uneven. "She carved this the winter before she took sick. Said it was a meadowlark, though it doesn't much look like one." He turned it over in his fingers. "I've carried it every day since, because it's the only thing I've got left that proves I loved something once and it was real." Ruth's throat tightened. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked why I'm doing this, and the truth is more complicated than gallantry." He set the little bird gently in her palm, his fingers lingering a moment against hers. "I watched you set my rib last night like it was the most natural thing in the world to take care of a stranger who owed you nothing. I watched you stand in that yard just now and refuse to be talked about like property. Chin up, not one tear, though God knows you'd have had cause. I haven't felt anything but numb for 18 months. Ruth. And in one day you've made me feel like a man who might want something again." She turned the little bird over in her hands, feeling the careful whittling of its wings, understanding the weight of what he'd just handed her. Not just wood, but grief and trust, and the fragile beginning of something neither of them had expected to survive long enough to feel. "My mother used to say scars mean a thing lived," Ruth said quietly. "I never understood if she meant the scar or the person wearing it. I think I understand now." She looked up at him. "I don't need rescuing, Tom. I've survived 22 years of him without a rescuer. But I wouldn't mind company. Someone who doesn't look at me and see something broken." "I don't see broken," he said. "I see somebody who's still standing after every reason to fall down." They sat like that a long while, the little wooden bird between them, the danger of Sunday's deadline still hanging over the yard like a storm not yet arrived. Somewhere past the tree line a dog barked at nothing, and the light went from gold to copper as the sun slid low, and for the first time in longer than Ruth could remember, the silence of the place did not feel like emptiness. It felt like the quiet before something worth waiting for. $50, she said finally, half to herself. He'd sell his own daughter for $50. He would, Tom agreed, and it's the last mistake of his I intend to let stand. Sunday came in gray and cold, clouds banked low over the hills, and Ruth stood at the window from first light watching the road for a rider who did not come at 8 or 9 or 10, while her father sat at the table cleaning his pistol with slow, deliberate care and a smile that told her he expected exactly this outcome, the drifter's promise proving as empty as every other promise made to her. "Told you," he said, not looking up. "Man like that talks big when there's an audience. Man like that don't show up with money in hand." At noon Walton Price arrived instead, smiling his small, satisfied smile, and Ruth felt the walls of her life closing in exactly the way they always had. Except this time, having tasted one day of being looked at like she mattered, the closing felt unbearable in a way it never had before. "Seems your rancher had better sense than to marry trouble," her father said to Price, loud enough for Ruth to hear from the doorway. "We can settle our business today after all." That was when the sound of hooves reached them. Not one rider, but several, and Ruth's heart lurched painfully before she recognized Tom at the front. His herd dogs flanking a small string of cattle he'd driven the 2 miles from his spread, and behind him old Ezra the blacksmith and 2 of the Hendricks boys, called in as witnesses. Tom dismounted stiffly, the rib still not healed. She could see it in the careful way he moved, and walked straight to her father with a folded deed in one hand and a leather pouch in the other. $50, he said, dropping the pouch on the porch rail hard enough to make the coins ring, and the deed to 4 head of cattle besides, which is more than the sum owed, because I want no man ever saying I didn't pay in full for what's worth infinitely more than any price you tried to put on her. Her father's face went through several colors before settling on something between fury and grudging calculation. Walton Price sputtered a protest that died the moment Tom turned to look at him. A look that needed no words behind it. The arrangement's done, Price, her father said finally, sweeping the coins into his pocket with the same greedy quickness he'd shown pouring whiskey the night before. Business is business. Ruth stepped off the porch then, into the gray morning light, and looked at her father. Truly looked at him, perhaps for the last time in the way a daughter looks at a father she's still hoping might surprise her. He did not surprise her. He counted his coins and did not meet her eyes, and something in her finally, fully, let go of the hope that he ever would. You sold me for $50, she said, and her voice was steady in a way that surprised even her. But I want you to understand something, Pa. You didn't sell me. You lost me. There's a difference, and I think somewhere under all that whiskey, you know it. She turned to Tom before her father could answer, and found him watching her with an expression that held no pity, no rescue, nothing but plain and steady respect. The way he'd looked at her since that first night by lamplight. You didn't have to buy cattle into the bargain, she said, and her voice broke a little despite herself. I told you, Tom said, I wasn't paying your father. I was proving something to you, that you're not a debt to be settled cheap. You're worth more than any man's ever bothered to say to your face, and I intend to spend the rest of my life saying it, if you'll have me. She looked down at the little carved bird she still carried in her apron pocket, worn warmer now from 3 days of her own handling, and thought of her mother's grave under the cottonwood, and thought that perhaps this was the kind of thing her mother had meant, that a scar, whether cut by a spooked horse or by 22 years of a father's cruelty, only meant a person had lived through something and come out the other side able to love again. I'll have you, she said, but I'll be doing my share of the ranching, and I'll not be told I can't lift what needs lifting. Tom laughed. A full, unguarded sound. The sound of a man who had genuinely believed himself done with joy and found it waiting for him anyway. Wouldn't dream of telling you different. They married 3 weeks later in the small church outside town, with old Ezra standing as witness and the Hendricks family filling half the pews, and if her father did not attend, Ruth found she did not grieve his absence the way she once might have. She had, at last, a table of her own to set, a roof that did not creak with old resentments, and a husband who looked at her scar in the evening lamplight and called it proof. Proof that she had lived and survived, and was still standing to be loved. Years later, when her own daughter asked about the small wooden bird kept on the mantel, its one wing still slightly uneven, Ruth would tell her it was carved by a woman she never met, carried across 200 miles of grief by a man who thought he was finished with hoping, and that sometimes the things most precious to us are the ones broken enough to prove they were real. The ranch prospered, slow and honest, the way Tom had promised it would. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the light went gold over the hills the way it had that first evening, he'd ridden into her yard half-broken and asking for nothing more than water. Ruth would sit on the porch beside her husband and think that her father had been wrong about exactly one thing in his life, but it had been the thing that mattered most.